Some wounds run so deep that time itself cannot heal them. For Eli King, an Amish widower in rural Pennsylvania, every sunrise brings another day of living with the unbearable weight of losing his teenage daughter Ruth in a tragic barn accident. His world has become nothing but empty prayers and silent tears. Until one morning when a small, muddy-faced girl emerges from the woods. Her name is Clara, and she's been surviving alone in an abandoned trailer since her mother disappeared. When she sees Eli crying on his porch, she asks the simple question that will change both their lives forever. Do you also cry from hunger? What happens when two broken hearts find each other in their darkest hour? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania countryside like a shroud, wrapping around the weathered fence posts and rolling fields that stretched toward distant hills. Eli King sat motionless on his front porch, his calloused hands resting on his knees, watching the sun struggle through the gray haze. At 52, his beard had grown longer and wilder than tradition dictated, streaked with silver that hadn't been there 2 years ago. His wife Hannah used to trim it for him, sitting him down in the kitchen chair with gentle hands and soft humming. But Hannah had been gone for 3 years now, taken by the cancer that ate through her like fire through dry wood. The wooden cross he'd carved for Ruth's grave lay beside him on the porch, its surface smooth from countless hours of his fingers tracing the grain. He'd made it from oak, the same tree where Ruth used to read her books in the summer shade, her auburn hair catching the light as she turned each page with the careful reverence of someone who treasured words. The cross should have been in the cemetery by now, marking her resting place beside her mother's headstone, but Eli couldn't bring himself to let it go. It was all he had left to hold. The barn accident had taken Ruth on a Tuesday morning in October, when the leaves were just beginning to turn. She'd been climbing the ladder to the hayloft, same as she'd done 1,000 times before, when the old rung gave way beneath her feet. Eli had been in the north field, mending a broken fence line, when he heard the crash. By the time he reached her, lying still in the scattered hay with her neck bent at an impossible angle, the light was already fading from her eyes. "Dad," she'd whispered, using the Pennsylvania Dutch word that sounded like music in her voice. "The quilt tell everyone I wanted to finish the quilt." Those were her last words, spoken in the voice of a 17-year-old girl who still believed she had all the time in the world. Now that unfinished quilt lay folded in the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, its bright squares of fabric blues and yellows and deep forest greens arranged in the pattern Ruth had chosen called Wedding Ring. She'd been making it for her hope chest, dreaming of the day she'd marry young Samuel Byler from the neighboring farm. They'd been sweet on each other since childhood, sharing shy glances across the church benches and walking together after Sunday services with the careful propriety of young Amish court. Eli rose from his chair, his joints protesting after the long night of sitting. Sleep had become a stranger to him, chased away by dreams that always ended the same way, with Ruth falling, while he ran through fields that stretched like oceans, never fast enough to catch her. The morning chores called to him with their familiar rhythm. 23 Holstein cows needed milking, chickens required feeding, and the garden wouldn't tend itself. These tasks had once been shared between him and Ruth, their conversations flowing as easily as milk into pail. She'd ask him about the old days, about his own father and the stories passed down through generations of kings who'd worked this same soil since 1847. "Tell me again about great-grandfather Isaac and the Underground Railroad," she'd say, her hands never pausing in their work as she scattered feed to the hens. "Ah, that's a story for another day," Eli would reply. But she'd persist with the gentle stubbornness that reminded him so much of Hannah Dodd. Now he worked in silence, moving through the motions like a man sleepwalking through his own life. The cows gathered at the gate, their bells chiming softly in the morning air. Bessie, the old matriarch of the herd, pressed her massive head against his shoulder as he approached, a gesture of comfort that animals seemed to understand better than humans. The Amish community of Cedar Valley had tried to help, as communities do in times of tragedy. Bishop Samuel Fisher had visited regularly in those first months, sitting in the kitchen with his white beard and kind eyes, speaking of God's plan and the hope of reunion in the world to come. The women brought casseroles and bread, their own, faces creased with sympathy and worry. The men offered to help with harvest, their strong backs and willing hands ensuring that grief wouldn't mean financial ruin. But Eli's grief ran deeper than community comfort could reach. It was a well with no bottom, a darkness that seemed to swallow every attempt at light. He attended Sunday services because not to do so would bring shame upon his family's name. But he sat in the back, his voice silent during the hymns that once filled his heart with joy. Brother Eli, Bishop Samuel had said just last week, his weathered face creased with concern, "It's time to consider your future. The Lord has work for you yet in this world." The words hung between them like dust motes in sunlight, beautiful and unreachable. Martha Yoder, his nearest neighbor, had taken it upon herself to find him a suitable wife, a widow from Lancaster County, with grown children and a sensible disposition. She'd arranged meetings that Eli attended out of politeness, but left early, his heart closed to possibilities that felt like betrayals of all he'd lost. The abandoned trailer had appeared in the woods about 6 months ago, tucked back among the oaks and maples where the old logging road petered out into deer paths. Eli had noticed it from his upper fields, a silver glint through the trees that didn't belong to the natural landscape. He'd assumed it was empty, another casualty of hard times and broken dreams that dotted the rural countryside like forgotten prayers. He'd been wrong. The little girl emerged from the tree line like something from a fairy tale, though not the kind with happy endings. Her dress was too big, hanging loose on her small frame, and her dark hair was tangled with burrs and bits of leaves. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, but her eyes held the wariness of someone much older, the careful watchfulness of a creature that had learned to survive on instinct alone. She approached with the cautious gait of a wild animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Her feet were bare despite the morning chill, and mud caked her legs up to her knees. In her small fist, she clutched something that caught the early light, a tarnished silver locket that swung gently as she walked. Eli watched her from his position beside the barn, his hand stilling on the milk pail. She stopped about 20 feet away, her gaze fixed on his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. He realized, with a start of shame, that he was crying again, the silent tears that came without warning, falling like rain from a cloudless sky. The child tilted her head, studying him with the frank curiosity of the very young. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the still morning air. "Do you also cry from hunger?" The question hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. In 4 simple words, this strange child had named something he couldn't, the gnawing emptiness that no amount of food could fill, the ache that lived in his chest like a second heart, beating out a rhythm of loss and longing. He stared at her, this muddy-faced angel who'd wandered out of the woods with truth on her lips, and for the first time in a year, Eli King felt something stir in the frozen landscape of his heart. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was movement. Like the first crack in ice that signals the coming of spring. The morning sun finally broke through the mist, casting long shadows across the farmyard and illuminating the child's face with golden light. She stood perfectly still, waiting for his answer to a question that would change everything. But Eli couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat, couldn't find words for the recognition that bloomed between them like a flower in winter. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging a truth they both carried, that there were hungers deeper than the body's needs, voids that echoed with the names of all we'd lost. The child took a step closer, and another, until she stood close enough that he could see the silver locket more clearly. Inside its tarnished frame was the faded photograph of a woman and a little girl, both smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of those who believe love lasts forever. "I'm Clara," she said, her voice growing stronger now that the first terrible question had been asked and answered. "Eli," he replied, his own voice rusty from disuse. And in that simple exchange of names, something began that neither of them could have imagined. A story of healing that would transform them both, written in the language of shared sorrow and the mysterious alchemy of love that finds a way to bloom even in the darkest soil. Clara swayed on her feet like a young tree in a storm, and Eli saw the moment when her small body finally surrendered to exhaustion. She crumpled to the ground with the boneless grace of a cloth doll, the silver locket slipping from her fingers to land in the dirt beside her pale cheek. He was beside her in 3 long strides, his knees hitting the earth with a jarring impact that sent sharp pains up his thighs. Up close, she was even smaller than he'd thought, her wrists no thicker than kindling wood. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and when he pressed his palm to her forehead, her skin burned with fever. The locket lay open where it had fallen, revealing the photograph he'd glimpsed before, a young woman with Clara's dark hair and serious eyes, holding a toddler who gazed at the camera with complete trust. The resemblance was unmistakable, but the woman's face was gaunt, marked by the hollow look that Eli recognized from his visits to Hannah during her illness. Not cancer, though, something different. Something that had carved away at her from the inside until only shadows remained. He scooped Clara up, surprised by how light she was, how easily she fit against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the sharp angles of her shoulder blades through the thin fabric of her dress. When had he last held a child? Ruth had been too old for such comfort in her final years, too aware of her approaching womanhood to seek solace in her father's arms. The farmhouse felt different with another person inside its walls, even an unconscious one. Eli carried Clara to the front room and laid her on the old horsehair sofa that had belonged to his grandmother. The afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting gentle patterns across her sleeping face. He should call someone. Bishop. Samuel, perhaps, or Martha Yoder with her endless store of remedies and opinions. But something held him back, a protective instinct he thought had died with Ruth. This child had sought him out for reasons he didn't understand, had asked a question that pierced straight to the heart of his pain. She deserved more than to wake up surrounded by strangers, however well-meaning. The fever broke near midnight. Eli had been dozing in his chair beside the sofa, starting awake every few minutes to check her breathing, when Clara's eyes fluttered open. She stared at the unfamiliar ceiling for a long moment before her gaze found his face. "You carried me inside," she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "You fainted." He kept his voice gentle, the way he'd spoken to frightened animals. "You've been sick." She pushed herself up on her elbows, wincing at some internal pain. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be trouble." The formal politeness in her voice broke his heart. What kind of life had taught a 7-year-old to apologize for being ill? "No trouble," he said. "Are you hungry?" "For food, I mean." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Yes, sir. Very hungry for food." He made her scrambled eggs and toast, simple fare that wouldn't upset a delicate stomach. She ate with careful concentration, as if the act of chewing required all her attention. Between bites, she answered his gentle questions. Her mother's name had been Linda Morrison. They'd lived in Pittsburgh until Clara was 5, when Linda's boyfriend started hitting them both. Linda packed their few belongings into garbage bags one night, and they'd run, always running, from one temporary shelter to another, one bad situation to the next. "Mama said we were going to find my daddy," Clara explained, her small hands wrapped around a mug of warm milk. "She said he lived somewhere in the country, where it was safe. But Linda had never found Clara's father if she'd ever really been looking for him. Instead, she'd found other men, other promises, other disappointments. The trailer in the woods had been their latest home, abandoned like all the others when Linda disappeared 3 weeks ago, with a man who smelled like cigarettes and made Clara hide in the closet when he visited. "She left me a note," Clara said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her dress pocket. She said she'd be back in a few days with money and food. Eli read the note with growing anger at a woman he'd never met. It was full of empty promises and desperate justifications. The words of someone who'd convinced herself that abandonment was somehow an act of love. "But she's not coming back," Clara continued with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who'd learned not to expect too much from the adults in her life. "The food ran out last week. I found some berries and ate grass like the rabbits do, but it made me sick." The internal conflict that had been building in Eli's chest since he'd first seen her finally reached its breaking point. Every instinct told him to retreat, to protect what remained of his shattered heart by avoiding further attachment. He'd barely survived losing Ruth and Hannah. How could he risk caring about anyone else? But looking at Clara's thin face and hollow eyes, he knew he'd already lost that battle. The moment she'd asked if he cried from hunger, she'd reached something in him that he'd thought was dead forever. "You can stay here tonight," he heard himself say. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Clara's face brightened with such pure relief that Eli had to look away. "Thank you, Mr. Eli. I promise I won't be any trouble. Just Eli," he corrected gently. "And children are supposed to be some trouble. That's how we know they're alive." He made up the small bedroom that had once belonged to Ruth, changing sheets that smelled of lavender and thyme. Clara stood in the doorway watching him, the silver locket once again clutched in her small fist. "This was your little girl's room," she said, not asking. Eli's hand stilled on the quilt knot Ruth's wedding ring pattern, but an older one made by his mother years before. "Yes. Where is she now?" The question he'd been dreading, asked with the innocent directness that only children possessed. "She died. A year ago." Clara nodded solemnly. "My daddy died too. Mama told me he went to heaven before I was born." Eli tucked the corners of the sheet with more care than necessary, buying time to steady his voice. "I'm sorry for your loss. Mama said sometimes people die, but their love stays behind, like echoes in empty houses." Clara climbed onto the bed, her small body making barely a dent in the mattress. "Do you think that's true?" He thought of Ruth's laughter still ringing in the barn rafters, of Hannah's gentle humming that seemed to drift through the kitchen on quiet evenings. "Yes," he said, "I think that's true." That night, Eli lay awake listening to the sounds of another person in his house, the soft breathing from Ruth's room, the creak of bed springs as Clara shifted in her sleep. Outside his window, the familiar landscape looked different somehow, as if the addition of one small girl had changed the very geometry of his world. In the morning, he would have to make decisions. There would be phone calls to make, authorities to contact, systems to navigate. Clara couldn't simply stay without paperwork, without official approval, without the world taking notice of what was happening in the quiet farmhouse at the end of Cedar Valley Road. But tonight, for the first time in a year, Eli King wasn't alone with his grief. Tonight, there was someone else under his roof who understood that some hungers went deeper than the body's needs. Someone else who knew what it meant to cry for reasons that had nothing to do with physical pain. As sleep finally claimed him, Eli's last conscious thought was of Clara's question from that morning, and his growing understanding that perhaps they'd both been starving for the same thing all along, not just for food or comfort, but for the simple, revolutionary act of being needed by another human soul. The rooster's crow pulled Eli from the deepest sleep he'd enjoyed in months, and for one disorienting moment, he forgot about the child sleeping in Ruth's room. Then he heard the soft padding of bare feet across wooden floors and remembered everything. Clara's collapse, her story, the decision that had seemed so clear in the darkness, but felt overwhelming in the harsh light of morning. He found her standing at the kitchen window, still wearing the oversized dress from yesterday, watching the sunrise paint the eastern hills gold and amber. Her dark hair caught the light, and something about the way she held herself alert but patient reminded him of Ruth at that age, before the world had taught her that waiting could be dangerous. "Good morning," he said, his voice still rough. With sleep dot she turned, offering him a shy smile. "I helped myself to water. I hope that's all right." "Of course." He moved to the stove, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar ritual of starting breakfast. "Are you feeling better?" "Much better, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I made the bed. Mama taught me to always leave a place tidier than I found it." The simple courtesy hit him unexpectedly. When had he stopped noticing such small kindnesses? Hannah had tried to teach Ruth the same lesson, and now here was this strange child, honoring the same values in a house that had forgotten how to hope dot after breakfast oatmeal with honey and fresh milk that Clara consumed with obvious pleasure. Eli led her outside to begin what he thought of as her education and survival. Not the desperate kind she'd been practicing in the abandoned trailer, but the deeper knowledge of how to live in harmony with the land that had sustained his family for generations. "First rule of farm life," he said, handing her a small bucket. "The animals eat before we do." The chickens scattered at their approach, then gradually returned as they recognized the routine of feeding time. Clara watched with fascination as Eli demonstrated the proper way to scatter grain, how to check for eggs without disturbing the brooding hens, the delicate balance of providing care without overstepping natural boundaries. "They're like little dinosaurs," she observed, making him laugh. Actually laugh for the first time since Ruth's death. Hannah used to say the same thing, he found himself admitting. She was convinced that chickens were plotting to take over the world, one pecked ankle at a time. Clara giggled, a sound like water over stones, and Eli felt something loosen in his chest. The lesson in cow milking proved more challenging. Bessie, usually the most patient of his herd, seemed to sense Clara's nervous energy and shifted restlessly as the child approached. Clara's first attempt sent milk splattering across the barn floor rather than into the bucket, earning an indignant move from the cow. "Like this," Eli demonstrated, his weathered hands gentle on the udder, firm but not harsh. "Think of it as a conversation. You're asking her to share, not demanding she give." Clara's second attempt was more successful, producing a thin stream of warm milk that gradually steadied as she found her rhythm. Her face lit up with such pure joy at this small accomplishment that Eli had to turn away, overwhelmed by memories of teaching Ruth these same skills when she was barely older than Clara was now dot by afternoon. Martha Yoder's curiosity had gotten the better of her discretion. She appeared at the kitchen door with a basket of fresh bread and the determined expression of a woman on a mission. "Eli King," she said, bustling past him without invitation. "I saw a child hanging laundry on your line this morning, and I think it's time you explained yourself." Clara, who had been helping him repair a section of fence, froze like a rabbit sensing a hawk. The fear that flickered across her face made Eli's protective instincts flare to life. "This is Clara," he said carefully. "She's staying with me for a while." Martha's eyes narrowed as she took in Clara's appearance, the too large dress, the careful way she held herself, the wariness that no 7-year-old should possess. "And where exactly did this child come from?" "That's between Clara and me," Eli replied, his voice carrying a warning that Martha chose to ignore. "Eli King, you cannot simply acquire a child like you would a stray cat. There are proper procedures, authorities that need to be contacted. What will people think?" The criticism stung because it echoed his own doubts, but seeing Clara's face grow paler with each word made his decision easy. People will think what they choose to think, Martha. They always do. That evening, after Martha had left with her, nose firmly out of joint, Eli found Clara in the barn, sitting beside his collection of woodworking tools. She was running her fingers over the smooth handles of chisels and planes, her touch reverent as she explored each curve and edge. "These are beautiful," she said softly. "Did you make them?" "My father made them," Eli replied, settling beside her on the workbench. "And his father before him. They've been shaping wood in this barn for over 100 years. Clara picked up a small carving knife, testing its weight in her palm. "What do you make with them?" "Furniture, mostly. Chairs and tables, cabinets for storing memories." He pulled a half-finished jewelry box from the shelf behind him, its surface smooth but undecorated. "I started this for Ruth's 17th birthday. Never finished it." "Could you teach me?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise I'll be careful." The request caught him off guard. Ruth had never shown much interest in woodworking, preferring her books and her needlework to the dusty precision of the shop. But Clara's eyes held a hunger that had nothing to do with food, the deep need to create something beautiful, to leave a mark on the world that would outlast her small hands. "Wood can be dangerous," he said slowly. "It requires patience and respect." "I have patience," Clara replied with the solemnity of someone making a sacred vow. "I know about respect. Mama taught me to respect anything that could hurt me if I wasn't careful." That night, Clara woke screaming. Eli reached her room in seconds, finding her thrashing against sheets that had become prison bars in her dreams. Her eyes were open but unseeing, lost in some terrible memory that had followed her into sleep. "Clara," he said gently, not touching her, but letting his voice cut through the nightmare. "You're safe. You're in the farmhouse with Eli." She focused on his face gradually, like someone swimming up from deep water. "I dreamed Mama came back," she whispered. "But she had that man with her, the one who hurt us. And they wanted to take me away from here." Eli felt his heart break a little more, if that was possible. "That was just a dream. You're safe here. Promise?" she asked, and the desperate hope in her voice nearly undid him. "I promise," he said, meaning it with every fiber of his being, even as he wondered how he could possibly keep such a vow. As Clara drifted back to sleep, Eli remained in the chair beside her bed, watching over her rest like a guardian angel with calloused hands and a broken heart. Outside the window, the Pennsylvania countryside slept under stars that had witnessed countless promises made in desperate moments, some kept, some broken, all offered with the same fierce hope that love might be enough to hold back the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about Clara's future and his right to shape it. But tonight she was safe under his roof, and that would have to be enough. 3 days into Clara's stay, she discovered Ruth's journal. Eli found her sitting cross-legged on the floor of Ruth's room, the leather-bound book open in her lap, her lips moving silently as she worked through words that challenged her reading skills. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the pages filled with Ruth's careful handwriting. "I'm sorry," Clara said immediately, closing the book with guilty haste. "I didn't mean to look at private things. I was just trying to understand why this room feels so sad." Eli's first instinct was to take the journal away, to lock it back in the cedar chest where it belonged with all the other remnants of his lost daughter's life. But something in Clara's expression stopped him, not curiosity or nosiness, but a deep recognition of grief that no child her age should possess. "What did you read?" he asked, settling on the floor beside her. Clara opened the journal to a page near the beginning, pointing to an entry dated just 6 months before Ruth's death. "She wrote about you teaching her to drive the buggy. She said you were patient, even when she couldn't get the reins right, and that you told her stories about her mama to make her less nervous." Eli remembered that day, Ruth's 15th birthday, when she'd finally been deemed old enough to handle the family's gentlest Mari. She'd been terrified of making a mistake, of disappointing him, and he'd spent hours in the barnyard teaching her the subtle communication between horse and driver. "She loved you very much," Clara continued, her finger tracing the words on the page. "She wrote about it all the time. How you sang while you worked, how you made her favorite pancakes on Sundays, how you never got angry when she tracked mud." Through the house, the words hit him like physical blows. He'd forgotten about the singing, about the Sunday pancakes, about the easy patience he'd once possessed. Grief had erased so much, leaving only the hollow shell of the man he'd been. "There's more," Clara said softly, turning to another page. "She wrote about wanting to be brave like you, and strong like her mama. She said she hoped someday she'd find someone who loved her the way you loved her mama, and that she'd be as good a mother as—" Stop. The word came out harsher than he'd intended, and Clara flinched as if he'd struck her. "I'm sorry, but I'm not ready to hear those words yet." Clara nodded with understanding far beyond her years. "Mama used to write letters to my daddy, even though he was dead. She said it helped to remember the good parts instead of just the missing parts." That afternoon, Eli attempted to teach Clara some basic Pennsylvania Dutch phrases, partly to distract himself from the emotional weight of Ruth's journal, and partly because he realized she would need to communicate with the community if she was going to stay. "Dude, Marie," he said slowly, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "Goody Mary," Clara repeated, mangling the pronunciation so thoroughly that Eli couldn't help but smile. "Good Marie," he corrected gently. "It means good morning." "Good Marie." She tried again, getting closer. "Why do you speak two languages? Pennsylvania Dutch isn't exactly German, and it isn't exactly English," Eli explained. "It's something our ancestors created when they came to this country, mixing the old language with the new. It helps us remember where we came from, while still belonging where we are." Clara nodded solemnly, as if this explanation held deep significance for her. "I think I understand. Like how I remember Mama, but I'm learning to live here with you." The simple wisdom of her words left him speechless. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Bishop Samuel Fisher arrived just as Eli was finishing the milking, his black buggy cutting a familiar silhouette against the sunset. Clara, who had been helping gather eggs, immediately moved closer to Eli's side, not hiding, but seeking the comfort of his presence. "Good evening, Eli," Bishop Samuel said, his weathered face kind but serious. "I've been hearing interesting stories about your household." "I'm sure you have," Eli replied carefully. "Martha Yoder never was one to keep quiet about her concerns." "Bishop." Samuel's eyes found Clara, taking in her too large dress, her careful posture, the way she stayed close to Eli without clinging. "And you must be Clara. I'm Samuel Fisher." "Good evening, Mr. Fisher," Clara said with formal politeness, offering a small curtsy that made the bishop's eyebrows rise slightly. "Gud Owen," he corrected gently, testing her. "Gud Owen, Clara," repeated, her pronunciation much better than her morning attempt. Eli felt an unexpected surge of pride. They talked as men do when skirting around difficult subjects, about the weather, the harvest prospects, the health of various community members. But all the while, Eli could feel the bishop's attention focused on Clara, who listened to their conversation with the intense concentration of someone gathering intelligence about a world she didn't yet understand. Finally, Bishop Samuel addressed the elephant in the room. "Eli, the community is concerned about your situation. A single man raising a child who isn't his own, it raises questions." "What kind of questions?" Clara asked before Eli could respond, her voice steady despite the tremor he could detect underneath. Bishop Samuel looked surprised by her directness. "Questions about propriety, child. About what's best for everyone involved." Clara's chin lifted with a defiance that reminded Eli powerfully of Ruth in her stubborn moods. Eli saved my life. He feeds me and keeps me safe and teaches me things. What's not proper about kindness? The bishop studied her for a long moment, and Eli saw something shift in his expression recognition, perhaps of a strength that belied Clara's small size and difficult circumstances. "You're right, child," he said finally. "Kindness is always proper. But kindness also requires wisdom, and wisdom sometimes means asking for help." After Bishop Samuel left with promises to return soon for a longer conversation, Clara sat beside Eli on the porch steps, both of them watching the last light fade from the western sky. "He wants to take me away, doesn't he?" she asked quietly. Eli considered lying, offering false reassurances, but Clara deserved honesty. "He wants to make sure you're taken care of properly. The community has rules about these things. And you? What do you want?" The question hung between them like a bridge he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Wanting meant risking loss, meant opening his heart to possibilities that terrified him. But looking at Clara's serious face, at the trust she'd placed in him despite having every reason to fear abandonment, Eli found his answer. "I want you to stay," he said simply, "for as long as you want to be here." Clara's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then I'll stay forever," she said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "Forever is a long time," Eli warned gently. "Not long enough," Clara replied, and Eli felt the last walls around his heart begin to crumble. The Cedar Valley Elementary School sat like a red brick fortress on the hill, overlooking the Amish farms, its playground bustling with children who had known each other since birth. Clara stood at the chain-link fence, clutching the new canvas book bag that Eli had bought for her in town, watching the easy camaraderie of kids who belonged to this place in ways she never could. "You'll do fine," Eli said, though his own stomach churned with anxiety. The decision to enroll Clara in school had been Bishop Samuel's suggestion, a way to normalize her situation while providing her with the education she'd been missing during her months of survival. "Miss Miller is a good teacher. She taught Ruth when she was your age." Sarah Miller emerged from the school building at that moment, as if summoned by her name. She was younger than Eli had expected, perhaps 30, with strawberry blonde hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She approached them with the confident stride of someone comfortable in her role as guardian of young minds. "You must be Clara," she said, crouching down to meet Clara's eyes. "I'm Miss Miller. I've been looking forward to meeting you." Clara glanced up at Eli for reassurance before responding. "Good morning, Miss Miller. Thank you for letting me come to your school." Oh, honey, this is your school now, too," Sarah said warmly. "Would you like me to show you around before the other children arrive?" The tour revealed a world that was both familiar and foreign to Clara. The classroom smelled of chalk and old books, with alphabet charts on the walls and rows of wooden desks scarred by generations of fidgeting students. Sarah's desk bore a photograph of a golden retriever and a small vase of wildflowers that she changed weekly. "We have 23 students in grades 1 through 8, Sarah explained as they walked through the building. "Most of our Amish children leave after 8th grade to work on their family farms, but a few continue their education. You'll be in 2nd grade, based on your age, but don't worry if you need extra help catching up." Clara nodded solemnly, though. Eli could see the wheels turning in her mind. She'd always been too bright, perhaps, for her own good. During their evening reading sessions, she demonstrated a hunger for knowledge that reminded him of Ruth's voracious appetite for stories. When the other children began arriving, the dynamic shifted immediately. Clara became the center of whispered conversations and curious stares. Most of the kids had heard some version of her story through the community grapevine, but the reality of her presence was different from the rumors. Why are you living with Mr. King? Asked Tommy Byler, Samuel's younger brother, with the blunt curiosity of an 8-year-old. Because he's kind, Clara replied simply. But he's not your dad, persisted Emma Yoder, Martha's granddaughter, her voice carrying the superior tone of someone repeating adult conversations. My grandma says it's not proper for little girls to live with men who aren't their fathers. Eli saw Clara's face flush with embarrassment and anger, but before he could intervene, another voice cut through the tension. Your grandma should mind her own business, said Rebecca Fisher, Bishop Samuel's daughter. At 12, she was the oldest student in the school, and her word carried weight among the younger children. The Bible says we should help orphans and widows. That's exactly what Mr. King is doing. The confrontation might have escalated, but Sarah Miller appeared with the practiced timing of an experienced teacher. Children, it's time to begin our day. Clara, would you like to sit near the window where you can see the hills? The morning lessons revealed both Clara's strengths and the gaps in her education. She could read better than most second graders, but her handwriting was shaky and her arithmetic skills were inconsistent. During geography, she surprised everyone by knowing the capitals of states she'd never visited, knowledge gleaned from the library books her mother had checked out during their more stable periods. How did you learn about Montana? Sarah asked after Clara correctly identified Helena as the capital. Mama and I were going to go there once, Clara said quietly. She said it was big enough that you could disappear if you needed to, but beautiful enough that you wouldn't mind being lost. The comment created an uncomfortable silence, reminders of the harsh realities that had shaped Clara's young life hanging in the air like smoke. Recess proved more challenging than the classroom. The unstructured time exposed the social dynamics that formal lessons could mask. Clara sat alone on a bench, watching the other children play games with rules she didn't understand. Part of groups she wasn't invited to join. Tommy Byler and his friends had formed a loose circle near the swings, their conversation loud enough for Clara to overhear. My dad says Mr. King isn't right in the head since his daughter died, Tommy said with the casual cruelty that children wield without understanding its power. He says that's why he's keeping that strange girl, because he's confused about what's real. Maybe she's not even real, suggested another boy, caught up in the game of speculation. Maybe she's a ghost like Ruth's ghost, come back to haunt him. Clara stood up so quickly that she knocked over her lunch pail, sending an apple rolling across the playground. Her face was pale with hurt and anger, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. I'm not a ghost, she said clearly. And Eli isn't. Confused. He's the kindest, smartest man I've ever known. And if you can't see that, then you're the ones who are confused. The playground fell silent. 22 pairs of eyes fixed on the small girl who had dared to defend the local hermit. Against the whispered judgments of their elders, Rebecca Fisher was the first to break the silence. She walked over to Clara and held out her hand. Want to help me collect leaves for our science project? The gesture broke the spell, and gradually, the playground resumed its normal rhythm. But the damage had been done. Clara spent the rest of the day quiet and withdrawn, answering questions with mechanical politeness, but offering nothing of herself. When Eli picked her up that afternoon, she climbed into the buggy without her usual chatter about the day's discoveries. They rode home in silence, the clip-clop of the horses' hooves the only sound between them. How was school? He finally asked as they turned into their driveway. Clara was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. Then, in a small voice that broke his heart, she said, Do you think I'm strange, Eli? Do you think there's something wrong with me? He pulled the buggy to a stop and turned to face her fully. Clara Morrison, he said seriously, you are one of the strongest, bravest, most remarkable children I have ever known. If anyone thinks there's something strange about kindness and courage, then they're the ones with the problem. Clara's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back all day. They said, "You're not right in your head for keeping me. They said I'm like a ghost." Eli felt a flash of anger so fierce it surprised him. These were children, repeating the thoughtless words of adults who should know better. But their cruelty had wounded Clara in ways that might take years to heal. "Let me tell you something about ghosts," he said gently. "Ghosts are memories that can't find peace. You're not a ghost, Clara. You're hope made flesh, walking around in worn-out shoes and a dress that's too big. You're the future, not the past." That evening, as Clara worked on her homework at the kitchen table, Eli found himself studying her bent head, the careful way she formed each letter, the determined set of her small shoulders. The school primer lay open beside her, its pages filled with simple sentences about simple lives. See Dick run. See Jane play. But Clara's life had never been simple, and neither had her courage. Tomorrow she would face the same whispers, the same curious stares, the same judgment of children who couldn't understand what it meant to survive on determination alone. But she would face it, because that's what brave people did. As Eli tucked her into bed that night, Clara looked up at him with serious eyes. "Eli, thank you for saying I'm not strange." "I didn't say you weren't strange," he corrected with a gentle smile. "I said there was nothing wrong with you. Strange can be wonderful, Clara. Strange can be exactly what the world needs." She smiled. Then, the first real smile he'd seen from her all day. "Then I guess we're both strange together." "Yes," Eli agreed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. "I guess we are." The knock at the door came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year and 2 weeks after Ruth's death. Eli was teaching Clara how to preserve apples from their small orchard, the same lesson he'd shared with Ruth every autumn since she was old enough to handle a paring knife. Clara's hands were sticky with juice, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked to keep the peel in one long, unbroken spiral. "If you can peel the whole apple without breaking the skin," Eli had told her, "you can throw it over your shoulder and see the first letter of your true love's name." "That's silly," Clara had replied, but she was trying extra hard anyway, caught up in the magic of old traditions. The knock interrupted their lesson-sharp, official, nothing like the gentle rap of neighbors or the familiar rhythm of community visitors. Through the window, Eli could see a small sedan parked in his driveway, government plates barely visible beneath a coating of rural dust. Janet Peterson introduced herself as a social worker from the Department of Children and Family Services, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty to be easily surprised. She wore a practical suit and carried a leather briefcase that clicked when she set it on the kitchen table. "Mr. King," she said, accepting his offer of coffee with professional politeness, "I'm here to conduct a welfare check on Clara Morrison." Clara, who had been washing apple juice from her hands at the sink, went very still. Eli could see her shoulders tense, could practically feel the fear radiating from her small frame. "Someone reported concerns about her living situation," Janet continued, pulling out a tablet and stylus. "Anonymous tip through our hotline. I need to ask you both some questions." The interview felt like an interrogation disguised as a conversation. Janet asked about Clara's sleeping arrangements, her meals, her medical care, her education. She wanted to see Clara's room, inspect the house, verify that proper boundaries were being maintained between a single man and an unrelated child. "Clara," Janet said gently, "can you tell me how you came to be living with Mr. King?" Clara's account was factual but emotionally distant, as if she were reciting someone else's story. She explained about her mother's disappearance, about living in the trailer, about finding Eli crying on his porch. But she left out the deeper truths, the question about hunger that had opened both their hearts, the gradual healing they'd found in each other's company. "Has Mr. King ever touched you in ways that made you uncomfortable?" Janet asked, her voice carefully neutral. Clara's face flushed with indignation. Eli would never hurt me. He's the gentlest person I know. I'm sure he is, honey. But I have to ask these questions. It's my job to keep children safe. After Janet left with promises to return for a follow-up visit, Clara disappeared into the barn. Eli found her an hour later, curled up in the hayloft where Ruth used to read, her face streaked with tears she'd been too proud to shed in front of the social worker. "She's going to take me away, isn't she?" Clara asked without looking at him. Eli climbed the ladder slowly, his joints protesting the familiar motion. "I don't know," he admitted, settling beside her in the sweet-smelling hay. "But I won't let it happen without a fight." What if fighting isn't enough? What if they decide I belong somewhere else? The question hung between them like a sword. Eli had been asking himself the same thing, lying awake at night wondering if his selfish desire to keep Clara was truly in her best interest. Maybe she did deserve a real family, parents who could give her things he couldn't: stability, legal security, a mother's love. "Do you want to stay here?" he asked quietly. Clara looked at him as if he'd asked whether she wanted to keep breathing. "This is home, Eli. You're my family now." The simple declaration nearly undid him. "Then we'll figure it out," he promised. "Whatever it takes." That afternoon brought another visitor, Abraham Fisher, Bishop Samuel's nephew, and the closest thing. Cedar Valley had to a lawyer. He'd driven down from Lancaster, where he practiced family law, in response to an urgent phone call from his uncle. "The situation is complicated," Abraham explained, spreading papers across the kitchen table while Clara worked on her homework nearby. "Legally, you have no standing as Clara's guardian. Her mother could return at any time and reclaim her, or the state could place her in foster care. What are our options?" Eli asked, though he dreaded the answer. "You could apply to become her official foster parent, but that process takes months and requires extensive background checks, home studies, training classes. Or," Abraham paused, glancing at Clara, "you could petition for emergency custody, based on abandonment, but that would require Clara to testify about her mother's neglect." Clara looked up from her arithmetic workbook. "What does that mean?" "It means you'd have to tell a judge about how your mother left you alone, how you survived in that trailer," Abraham explained gently. "It might be difficult to talk about." Clara's chin lifted with familiar determination. "If it means I can stay with Eli, I'll tell them anything they need to know." 2 days later, Eli discovered Clara in Ruth's room, wearing the new dress he'd commissioned from Mary Stoltzfus, the community's finest seamstress. The dress was deep blue wool with a white collar, simple but well-made, sized to fit Clara's small frame perfectly. She stood before Ruth's mirror, smoothing the skirt with careful hands. "Do I look proper?" she asked anxiously. "Like a girl who belongs in a nice family?" The question broke Eli's heart. Clara had been trying so hard to fit into their world, learning Pennsylvania Dutch phrases, helping with chores, earning good marks at school. But underneath her determination, he could see the fear, the terrible anxiety of a child who'd learned that belonging was always temporary. "You look beautiful," he said truthfully. "But Clara, you don't have to earn your place here. You belong because I want you to belong, not because you've proven yourself worthy." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "But what if I mess up? What if I do something wrong and you change your mind?" "Look at me," Eli said seriously. "I lost my daughter and my wife. I know what real loss feels like. Do you think I would risk caring about you if I wasn't absolutely certain about wanting you in my life?" That evening, they established a new routine. After supper and homework, they would sit together in the front room while Eli worked on small woodworking projects, and Clara drew pictures in a sketchbook Sarah Miller had given her. Her drawings showed their daily life with an artist's eye for detail: Eli milking cows, herself feeding chickens, the two of them working side by side in the garden. "You have real talent," Eli observed, watching her capture the way afternoon. Light slanted through the barn windows. Mama used to draw, Clara said, not looking up from her work. She said art was the only way she could make something beautiful out of all the ugly things that happened to us. The observation was so mature, so heartbreakingly wise, that Eli had to pause in his sanding to collect himself. "Your mother sounds like she was trying her best," he said carefully. Clara nodded. She was. But her best wasn't good enough to keep. Yo, safes. That's why she had to leave. She knew I'd be better off without her. The matter-of-fact way Clara accepted her abandonment, the generous interpretation she placed on her mother's choices, revealed a capacity for forgiveness that humbled Eli. Here was a child who had every reason to be bitter, yet she chose understanding instead. "You're wise beyond your years," he told her. "I had to grow up fast," Clara replied simply. "But I like being a kid here with you. I like that I can be silly sometimes, or scared, or just little." As October deepened into November, their life together found its rhythm despite the hovering uncertainty of Clara's legal status. She excelled in school, winning over skeptical classmates with her quick wit and generous nature. Even Emma Yoder had begun including Clara in playground games, though Martha Yoder still sniffed disapprovingly whenever their paths crossed. But the anonymous complaints continued. Someone in Eli suspected he knew who kept calling social services with concerns about Clara's welfare. Each call triggered another visit, another round of questions, another reminder that their happiness existed at the mercy of others' judgment. "We need to be prepared," Abraham warned during one of his visits. "If this keeps up, they may move to remove Clara from your home pending a full investigation." Clara, who had been quietly listening from the next room, appeared in the doorway. "Then, we need to make sure they can't," she said with the fierce determination of someone who'd already lost everything once and refused to do it again. "What do you mean?" Eli asked. Clara's eyes held a resolve that made her seem far older than her 8 years. "I mean, we fight. Whatever it takes, we fight to stay together." Looking at her face, stubborn and scared and absolutely certain, Eli felt something shift inside him. He'd spent a year mourning what he'd lost. It was time to start fighting for what he'd found. The envelope arrived on a gray December morning, delivered by a process server who apologized for interrupting their breakfast but needed Eli's signature on the certified mail receipt. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Eli signed the papers. Her small hands pressed against the glass, leaving fog marks that bloomed and faded with her nervous breathing. The return address read Morrison vs. King, Family Court Division. But it was the accompanying letter that made Eli's blood run cold. Jake Morrison, Clara's biological father, was petitioning for immediate custody of his daughter, claiming to have completed a court-ordered rehabilitation program and maintained sobriety for 6 months. "What does it say?" Clara asked, though something in Eli's expression had already given her the answer. Eli read the legal documents twice before looking up at her. "Your father is alive, Clara. He wants you to come live with him." The words hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a dying fire. Clara's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, unmistakable terror. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Mama said he was dead. She showed me his picture and said he went to heaven before I was born." Eli studied the papers more carefully, seeing the harsh truth laid out in legal terminology. Jake Morrison had indeed been absent from Clara's life, but not because of death, because of addiction, incarceration, and a restraining order Linda Morrison had filed after a domestic violence incident when Clara was 2 years old. "Sometimes people tell stories to protect the ones they love," Eli said gently. "Your mother was trying to keep you safe." Clara sank into her chair, her breakfast forgotten. What kind of man was he? Why did Mama have to protect me from my own father? The attached police reports answered that question in clinical detail. Jake Morrison had a history of drug abuse, theft, and assault. He'd been in and out of prison for most of Clara's life, finally entering a court-mandated treatment program after his latest arrest for possession with intent to distribute. The rehabilitation center vouches for his sobriety, Abraham Fisher explained later that morning, having driven down from Lancaster as soon as Eli called. His counselor reports significant progress, steady employment, and genuine remorse for his past actions. Clara listened to the adults discuss her future with the stillness of a small animal hiding from predators. When Abraham asked if she remembered her father at all, she shook her head. "I remember hiding," she said quietly. "Mama would put me in the closet and tell me to be very quiet when the angry man came. I thought it was different angry men, but maybe it was always the same one." The memory made Eli's hands clench into fists. The idea of this child, his child, he realized with startling clarity, being returned to someone who had terrorized her, was unthinkable. "What are our legal options?" Eli asked Abraham. "Limited," Abraham admitted. "Biological parents have strong rights, even when they've been absent. The court will consider Jake's rehabilitation efforts, his stable housing, and employment, his expressed desire to make amends. And Clara's wishes? Children her age don't have much legal voice in custody decisions. The court's primary concern is her physical safety and stability, not necessarily her emotional preferences." That afternoon, Eli found Clara in the barn, sitting beside his workbench where a half-finished birdhouse waited for completion. She was holding one of his smaller chisels, testing its edge against her thumb with the careful attention he'd taught her. "I won't go," she said without looking at him. "I don't care what any judge says. This is my home now. Clara, no." She set down the chisel and turned to face him, her young face set with determination that reminded him painfully of Ruth in her most stubborn moods. "I lived through being abandoned once. I survived in that trailer by myself for weeks. I'm not helpless, Eli. If they try to make me go with him, I'll run away." The fierce protectiveness that had been growing in Eli's heart for months suddenly blazed into something approaching parental fury. "You won't have to run away," he said firmly. "We'll fight this together." "How?" "You said yourself that he has legal rights." Eli pulled up a stool beside her, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes the law isn't the same as justice. Sometimes people have to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." 3 days later, Jake Morrison arrived in Cedar Valley. Eli saw him first at the general store, a thin man in his 30s with Clara's dark hair and hollow cheeks that spoke of hard living. He wore clean clothes and moved with the careful precision of someone trying very hard to appear stable. But there was something in his eyes, a restless hunger, that made Eli's protective instincts flare. "You must be Eli King," Jake said, approaching, with an outstretched hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Jake Morrison. I believe you've been taking care of my daughter." Eli shook the offered hand briefly, noting the slight tremor in Jake's grip. "Clara is well cared for." "I'm sure she is, and I appreciate everything you've done for her. But she belongs with her family now." "Family," Eli repeated, letting the word hang between them like a challenge. Jake's smile faltered slightly. "I know. I made mistakes in the past, but I've changed. I've been clean for 6 months. I have a job at a warehouse in Pittsburgh, a decent apartment. I can provide for her now." "And where were you when she was living alone in an abandoned trailer, eating berries and grass to survive?" The direct question hit its mark. Jake's face flushed, and for a moment, Eli glimpsed the anger that lurked beneath his careful facade. "I was getting my life together so I could be the father she deserves." "She already has what she deserves," Eli said quietly. "A home where she's safe, loved, and valued for who she is, not what she represents." That evening, Jake arrived at the farmhouse demanding to see Clara. Eli met him at the front door. Blocking his view of the interior, She's frightened of you, Eli said bluntly. Forcing a meeting won't help your case. She's my daughter. Jake sighed, his veneer of politeness beginning to crack. I have rights. You have biological connection, Eli corrected. Rights earned through love and sacrifice, and putting her needs before your own. Through the window, he could see Clara hiding. Behind the kitchen curtains, her small face pale with terror. The sight strengthened his resolve. Look, Jake said, trying a different approach. I understand she's become attached to you. That's natural. But I'm her father, and I've worked hard to get clean, to become someone she can be proud of. Don't I deserve a chance to prove myself? The question isn't what you deserve, Eli replied. The question is, what's best for Clara? And what's best for her is staying where she feels safe and loved. Jake's mask slipped entirely then, revealing the entitled anger beneath. You think you can keep my kid just because you want her? You think some judge is going to give custody to an old man over her real father? We'll see, Eli said calmly. Though his heart was racing after Jake left, Clara emerged from her hiding place, tears streaming down her face. I remember him now, she whispered. I remember being scared, remember Mama crying after he left. Eli pulled her into his arms, feeling her small body tremble against his chest. You're safe here, Clara. Whatever happens, you're safe with me. But even as he spoke the words, Eli wondered if they were true. Legal documents could be very different from moral certainties, and judges didn't always see the difference between providing a home and building a family. That night, he sat in his chair beside Clara's bed, watching her sleep fitfully, her small hands clenched into fists even in dreams. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and court dates, custody evaluations, and character witnesses. But tonight she was his daughter in every way that mattered, and he would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. The legal papers on his kitchen table seemed to mock him with their official language and bureaucratic certainty. But Eli King had learned something important in the months since. Clara had wandered out of the woods and into his heart. Sometimes the most important battles weren't won with legal arguments, but with the fierce, protective love of a parent who refused to let go. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The community response to Clara's custody battle surprised everyone, most of all Eli himself. Word spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire, and by the end of the week, Abraham Fisher's small law office was flooded with character reference letters, written in the careful handwriting of farmers and craftsmen who had known the King family for generations. Bishop Samuel Fisher was the first to offer testimony, arriving at Eli's kitchen table with a letter that spoke of spiritual transformation and the sacred duty to care for orphan children. I've watched you these past months, he told Eli, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he read from his own words. I've seen a man emerge from the depths of grief to become the father this child needs. That's not just healing, that's resurrection. Martha Yoder's letter was perhaps the most surprising. Despite her initial concerns about propriety, she wrote eloquently about Clara's transformation from a frightened waif to a confident, well-adjusted child. I may have had reservations about the arrangement, she admitted when she delivered the letter personally, but I cannot argue with results. That child blooms under your care like a flower finally given proper soil. Sarah Miller's testimony was the most detailed, documenting Clara's academic progress and emotional development with the precision of an educator who understood the long-term impact of stability on learning. In my 15 years of teaching, she wrote, I have rarely seen such dramatic positive change in a child. Clara's growth in confidence, curiosity, and social skills directly correlates with the security she has found in Mr. King's home. But it was Rebecca Fisher's letter that moved Eli to tears. Bishop Samuel's 12-year-old daughter had written about watching Clara learn to trust again, about the way she gradually opened up to friendship and community. Before Mr. King, Clara was like a wild animal always ready to run. Now she belongs here, and we belong to her too. Abraham Fisher spread the letters across his desk like pieces of a complex puzzle. These are powerful testimonies, he said, but we need to prepare for Jake Morrison's side of the story. He'll have his own witnesses, counselors from the treatment center, employers who'll vouch for his sobriety, possibly family members. Clara sat quietly in the corner of Abraham's office, drawing in her sketchbook while the adults discussed her future. Her pictures had grown more detailed over the months, and today she was working on a drawing of the farmhouse with meticulous attention to every window, every board, every flower in Hannah's old garden. "Clara," Abraham said gently, "I need to ask you some difficult questions about your father, about what you remember from when you were little." Clara's hand stilled on her pencil. "What kind of questions?" "About times when you felt scared or unsafe, about why your mother took you away." The memories came in fragments, flashes of anger and raised voices, the feeling of being crushed between adults who fought like natural disasters. Clara described hiding in closets while furniture crashed in other rooms, the way her mother would pack their belongings in garbage bags with shaking hands, always in the middle of the night, always running from something Clara was too young to understand. "It made Mama cry," Clara said quietly. "Not sad crying, like when someone you love goes away. Scared crying, like when you hurt yourself and don't know if it's going to stop hurting." Abraham made careful notes, his face grave. "Would you be willing to tell these things to a judge?" Clara looked at Eli, drawing strength from his presence. "If it means I can stay home, yes." The custody hearing was scheduled for the second Tuesday in January, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Eli used those weeks to establish routines that demonstrated stability and permanence. He enrolled Clara in piano lessons with Emma Stoltzfus, signed her up for the community's children's choir, and began teaching her advanced woodworking techniques that required patience and precision. "See how the grain runs through the wood?" he explained one evening, guiding her small hands as she worked a plane across a piece of oak. "You have to respect what's already there. Work with it instead of fighting it." Clara nodded seriously, then looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "Like families, right? You can't force them to happen, but you can make something beautiful if you're patient and careful." The observation took his breath away. "Yes," he managed, "exactly like families." Janet Peterson returned for a final home visit 3 days before the hearing, bringing a colleague who specialized in child psychology. They observed Clara's interactions with Eli, noted the comfortable familiarity of their routines, the easy affection that had developed between them. "She calls you Eli, not Dad," the psychologist observed. "That's her choice," Eli replied. "I've never asked her to call me anything but my name. And if she wanted to call you Dad..." Eli glanced at Clara, who was setting the table for lunch with the careful precision he taught her. "I'd be honored." Clara's head came up at that, and for a moment, father and daughter looked at each other with perfect understanding. The evening before the hearing, the house filled with visitors. Bishop Samuel came with his wife and daughter, Rebecca. Sarah Miller arrived with a folder of Clara's best schoolwork. Even some of the community's younger families stopped by, children who had become Clara's friends clustering around her with the fierce loyalty of youth. "We brought you something," Rebecca announced, pulling out a quilt that had been crafted by the women of the community. It was made in the wedding ring pattern, the same design Ruth had been working on before her. Death, but the colors were different, softer, more suited to a child's room. Every family contributed a square, Bishop Samuel's wife explained. "It's your place in our community, sewn into fabric." Clara ran her hands over the intricate stitching, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." As the visitors gradually departed, leaving warm hugs and promises of prayer, Eli found himself alone with Clara in the kitchen. She sat at the table, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders like a cape, working on a letter she'd been writing to the judge. "What are you telling him?" Eli asked, settling beside her. Clara showed him the careful handwriting, each letter formed with painstaking precision. "I'm explaining about different kinds of families, about how sometimes the people who give birth to you aren't the same as the people who help you grow." The letter was remarkable in its simplicity and honesty. Clara wrote about feeling safe for the first time in her life, about learning to trust that tomorrow would come with food and kindness and the promise of belonging. She described Eli not as perfect, but as present, always there when she needed him, patient with her fears, generous with his time and attention. "I know some people think it's wrong for me to live with Eli because he's not my real dad," she had written. "But he feels real to me. He feels like home." That night, Eli stood in the doorway of Clara's room, watching her sleep beneath the community quilt. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and judges, custody evaluations, and character witnesses. Jake Morrison would present his case for redemption and second chances, supported by professionals who believed in rehabilitation and family reunification. But tonight, Clara was his daughter in every way that mattered, not because of blood or legal documents, but because of love freely given and gratefully received. She had wandered into his life, asking if he cried from hunger, and together they had discovered that the deepest hungers were fed not by food, but by belonging. Whatever tomorrow brought, they had already won the most important battle. They had become a family. The law might not recognize it, society might question it, but in the quiet darkness of the farmhouse, where two wounded souls had found healing in each other's company, love had already written its own verdict. Eli pulled Clara's door almost closed, leaving it open just enough to hear if she called for him in the night. Tomorrow would test everything they had built together, but tonight they were home, and that was enough. In the kitchen, Ruth's Bible lay open on the table where Clara had left it after their evening prayers. The highlighted verses seemed to glow in the lamplight. Words about love enduring all things, about hope being the substance of things not seen, about the peculiar mathematics of grace that made 1 + 1 equal everything that mattered in the world. The custody hearing would determine Clara's legal future, but it could never touch what they had already become to each other, that belonged to them forever, written not in legal documents, but in the language of shared meals and quiet conversations, of tears comforted and dreams encouraged, of two hearts that had recognized each other across the impossible distance between loss and hope. The courthouse in Lancaster County felt like a cathedral built for judgment rather than worship, its high ceilings and marble floors echoing with the footsteps of people whose lives hung in the balance of legal decisions. Eli carried Ruth's Bible in his coat pocket, its familiar weight a comfort against his ribs as he walked beside Clara toward the family court division. Clara wore her blue dress and carried herself with dignity that made her seem older than her 8 years. She had braided her own hair that morning, refusing Eli's awkward attempts to help, determined to present herself as capable and mature. In her small hands, she clutched the letter she'd written to Judge Margaret Thornton, its pages worn soft from nervous handling. Jake Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table with his court-appointed attorney, a young public defender who had drawn the unenviable task of arguing for family reunification in a case where the family had been broken by violence and neglect. Jake had cleaned up well for court, his hair neatly trimmed, his clothes pressed, his face bearing the earnest expression of a man trying to convince the world he'd changed. Judge Thornton was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every variation of human tragedy that could land in family court. She read through the case files with methodical attention, occasionally glancing up at the parties involved with the careful assessment of someone whose decisions shaped children's lives. "Mr. Morrison," she said, calling Jake to testify first, "please tell the court about your relationship with your daughter and your plans for her care." Jake's testimony was polished, clearly rehearsed with his attorney. He spoke about his addiction struggles with appropriate remorse, his commitment to sobriety with convincing sincerity. He had completed a 6-month residential treatment program, maintained steady employment at a Pittsburgh warehouse, and secured a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood with good schools. "I know I made terrible mistakes," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of humble regret. "I lost years of my daughter's life to drugs and selfishness. But I've changed, Your Honor. I'm clean, I'm working, and I'm ready to be the father Clara deserves." His counselor from the treatment center testified about Jake's progress, his engagement with therapy, his expressed commitment to making amends with his daughter. His employer vouched for his reliability and work ethic. Even his landlord spoke positively about his character as a tenant. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Thornton said during cross-examination, "what is your daughter's favorite color?" Jake hesitated, caught off guard by the simple question. Well, I imagine it's pink. Most little girls like pink." "And her favorite subject in school?" Another pause. "Reading, probably. Kids like stories." Abraham Fisher pressed gently but persistently, revealing the vast gaps in Jake's knowledge of his daughter's life. He didn't know about Clara's artistic talents, her love of woodworking, her fear of thunderstorms, or her habit of humming while she worked. He couldn't name a single one of her friends, didn't know her teacher's name, had no idea that she preferred blue to pink, and found mathematics easier than reading. "Mr. Morrison," Abraham continued, "can you tell the court why your daughter spent 3 weeks alone in an abandoned trailer, surviving on berries and grass?" "I didn't know where Linda had taken her," Jake replied, his composure beginning to crack. "I was in treatment. I couldn't leave the program to look for them." "But you knew Ms. Morrison had a history of instability, of moving frequently to avoid creditors and dangerous situations. Didn't you have a responsibility to ensure your daughter's safety?" Jake's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The court could see the fundamental disconnect between Jake's claims of paternal responsibility and his actual knowledge of his child's needs and experiences. When Clara was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand with the careful composure she'd practiced in Abraham's office. Judge Thornton spoke to her gently, explaining that she could take breaks if needed, that telling the truth was the most important thing she could do. "Clara," the judge said, "can you tell me about living with Mr. King?" Clara's voice was steady, as she described her daily life on the farm, helping with chores, attending school, learning to work with wood. She spoke about feeling safe for the first time she could remember, about having enough food and warm clothes and adults who kept their promises. "Do you remember living with your father before?" Judge Thornton asked carefully. Clara nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "I remember hiding in closets when he was angry. I remember Mama packing our things in garbage bags and leaving in the middle of the night. I remember being scared that he would find us." "And how do you feel about the possibility of living with him now?" The question hung in the courtroom air. Clara looked across the room at Jake, studying his face with the serious attention of someone trying to recognize a stranger who claimed to know her. "He seems different," she said finally, calmer. "But I don't know him, and he doesn't know me. Eli knows that I'm afraid of thunderstorms and that I like to draw pictures of the farm. He knows I hum when I'm happy and that I cry when I'm really tired but trying to be brave." She pulled her letter from her pocket, the pages trembling slightly in her small hands. "I wrote something for you, Judge Thornton, about families and what makes them real." Judge Thornton accepted the letter with the solemnity due to a child's careful words. As she read Clara's simple explanation of love and belonging, of safety found and trust rebuilt, the courtroom fell silent, except for the soft sound of pages turning and the weight of a child's truth settling into the space between law and justice. Judge Thornton set Clara's letter aside carefully and leaned forward, her expression thoughtful as she addressed the adults in the courtroom. This court will take a 30-minute recess to review the testimony and evidence presented. When we reconvene, I will render my decision regarding custody of Clara Morrison. The weight felt eternal. Clara sat beside Eli on a hard wooden bench. In the courthouse hallway, her small hand tucked securely in his. The community members who had come to support them, Bishop Samuel, Sarah Miller, even Martha Yoder, formed a protective circle around them, speaking in hushed tones about anything except the decision that would determine Clara's future. Jake Morrison paced near the water fountain, his earlier composure completely gone. His attorney tried to calm him, but Eli could see the agitation. Building, the carefully constructed facade of rehabilitation beginning to crack under pressure. "This is ridiculous," Jake muttered, his voice carrying across the marble hallway. "She's my daughter. My blood. Some judge can't just decide that doesn't matter." Abraham Fisher appeared at Eli's elbow, his face carefully neutral. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you've given Clara something invaluable. You've shown her what love looks like, what family feels like. That can never be taken away." When court reconvened, Judge Thornton's expression revealed nothing of her internal deliberations. She called the courtroom to order and asked everyone to remain seated for the reading of her decision. This case presents the court with a fundamental question about the nature of family and the best interests of a child. She began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "The law recognizes the importance of biological relationships and the right of fit parents to raise their children. It also recognizes that a child's welfare supersedes all other considerations." Clara's grip on Eli's hand tightened. "Mr. Morrison, I acknowledge your efforts at rehabilitation and your expressed desire to reconnect with your daughter. Your counselors speak highly of your progress, and your employer vouches for your stability. These are commendable achievements that reflect personal growth and determination." Jake straightened in his chair, hope flickering in his eyes. "However," Judge Thornton continued, "this court must consider not only your current circumstances, but also the trauma you inflicted on your daughter during her formative years, your absence during her time of greatest need, and your fundamental lack of knowledge about her current life, needs, and personality." The hope in Jake's eyes began to dim. Clara Morrison spent 3 weeks alone in an abandoned trailer, surviving on inadequate food and facing dangers no child should endure. During that time, Mr. Morrison, you made no effort to locate her or ensure her safety. It was Mr. King who found her, who provided immediate care, who has spent the past months learning her needs and fears, her strengths and dreams. Judge Thornton picked up Clara's letter, her voice softening slightly. "This 8-year-old child has written to this court with remarkable wisdom about the difference between biological connection and genuine family bonds. She understands, perhaps better than the adults in this room, that families are built through daily acts of love, through consistent care, through the patient work of understanding another person's heart." Clara's breathing became shallow, each word from the judge bringing them closer to a decision that would reshape both their lives. The evidence presented to this court shows that Clara Morrison has thrived under Mr. King's care. Her academic performance has improved dramatically, her emotional development has stabilized, and she has formed healthy relationships within her community. She has found not just shelter, but a true home. Judge Thornton's gavel rested in her hand, the symbol of final decision that would determine Clara's fate. "Mr. Morrison, while I recognize your parental rights and your efforts at self-improvement, I cannot ignore the clear evidence that Clara's best interests lie in remaining with Mr. King. Your daughter has endured enough upheaval and trauma in her young life. She deserves the stability and love she has found." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder in the hushed courtroom. "Custody of Clara Morrison is hereby awarded to Elijah King, with provision for supervised visitation rights for Mr. Morrison. Should he choose to pursue them, and should Clara consent to such visits when she reaches an appropriate age to make that decision herself? The words hit Eli like a physical force, relief and joy, an overwhelming responsibility crashing over him in waves. Beside him, Clara began to cry, not the silent tears of grief he'd grown accustomed to, but the open sobs of a child whose deepest fear had been lifted from her shoulders. Jake Morrison erupted from his chair, his careful composure finally shattering completely. "This is insane," he shouted, his face flushed with rage. "She's my daughter. You can't just give her away to some stranger." "Mr. Morrison," Judge Thornton said sternly, "you will control yourself in my courtroom or be held in contempt." But Jake was beyond caring about contempt charges. 6 months clean. He raged. 6 months of meetings and therapy and jumping through every hoop they put in front of me. And for what? So some old man can steal my kid? Security officers moved toward him, but Jake's attorney managed to calm him enough to avoid immediate arrest. Still, his outburst had revealed the anger that lurked beneath his rehabilitation, the entitlement that no amount of therapy had been able to cure. As Jake was escorted from the courtroom, still muttering about appeals and injustice, Clara looked up at Eli with eyes bright with tears and relief. "Can we go home now?" she asked simply. "Yes," Eli said, his own voice thick with emotion. "We can go home." 6 months after the custody hearing, Clara stood in the doorway of Eli's woodworking shop, watching him put the finishing touches on a jewelry box made from Pennsylvania cherry wood. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn windows, casting everything in golden light that seemed to promise that good things were not only possible, but permanent. "Is that for someone special?" she asked, approaching the workbench with the confident stride of a child who knew she belonged wherever she chose to walk. "Very special," Eli confirmed, running his palm over the smooth surface one final time before turning to face her. "It's for a girl who asked me once if I cried from hunger, and taught me that some hungers are fed by love." Clara's face lit up with understanding and delight. "It's for me? For you? For your treasures." He opened the box to reveal an interior lined with soft blue velvet, perfect for holding the small artifacts of a childhood finally allowed to unfold in safety. Her silver locket, special stones from the creek, perhaps letters from new friends she was slowly learning to trust. Clara ran her fingers over the intricate carving Eli had worked into the lidded tree with deep roots and spreading branches, small birds finding shelter in its leaves. "It's beautiful." "Thank you. There's something else," Eli said, reaching into his pocket to pull out an official-looking document. The adoption papers came through. "If you sign them, I'll officially be your father, and you'll officially be my daughter." Clara took the papers, with hands that had grown steady and sure over the months of security. She'd grown taller, too, no longer the waif who had emerged from the woods, but still small enough to curl up in Eli's lap when thunderstorms rolled through the valley. "What? Do I sign?" she asked seriously. "Right here, next to where I signed." Eli pointed to a line marked with a yellow sticky note. "But Clara, you should know you don't have to sign these papers to be my daughter. You already are, in every way that matters. This just makes it official for the rest of the world." Clara nodded solemnly, then picked up a pen and carefully wrote her name in the script Sarah Miller had been helping her perfect. "Clara King," she said, testing the sound of it. "I like how that sounds." The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. There had been nightmares that gradually faded, moments of panic when Clara thought Eli might disappear like every other adult who had promised to stay. There had been court-ordered therapy sessions to help her process the trauma of abandonment, community meetings to address the whispered concerns about their unconventional family. But there had also been small victories that built into larger ones. Clara's art had blossomed under Sarah Miller's encouragement. Her drawings now displayed proudly on the refrigerator alongside spelling tests marked with gold stars. She'd made friends slowly, but genuinely. Rebecca Fisher remained her closest companion. But even Emma Yoder had been won over by Clara's gentle humor and fierce loyalty. The woodworking lessons had continued, and Clara had proven to have not just interest but real talent. Her small hands could achieve a delicacy with the tools that reminded Eli of his own father's work. The jewelry box she'd made for Sarah Miller's birthday had been her masterpiece so far, a simple design executed with the patience and attention to detail that marked a true craftsperson. "The community quilt looks perfect in here," Clara observed, glancing around the shop where her latest drawing hung beside Eli's tool collection. She'd sketched the entire farm from memory, capturing not just the buildings and fences, but the feeling of the place. The way morning light caught the barn roof, the comfortable sprawl of Hannah's garden, the sense of roots growing deep into rich soil. Martha Yoder had been among the most dramatic converts to their cause. After the custody hearing, she'd appeared at their door with a basket of her finest preserves and a grudging admission that she'd been wrong about their arrangement. "I may have been hasty in my judgment," she'd said, which was as close to an apology as anyone could expect from Martha Yoder. "That child has brought out the best in you, Eli King, and you've clearly brought out the best in her." Now Martha stopped by regularly, ostensibly to check on Clara's progress, but actually to bask in the satisfaction of a community member who had witnessed something remarkable, a family formed not by accident of birth, but by deliberate choice, daily renewed through acts of love and commitment. Bishop Samuel had performed a simple blessing ceremony for their newly legal family, gathering the community in the farmhouse for an evening of shared food and quiet celebration. As they sat around the kitchen table where Clara had first eaten a real meal in weeks, where she'd struggled through homework and learned to trust that tomorrow would come with its promises intact, Eli felt the presence of Hannah and Ruth like a benediction. They weren't gone, they lived on in the love that had made room for Clara, in the skills passed down through generations, in the faith that insisted broken things could be made whole. That evening, as Clara worked on her homework at the kitchen table and Eli prepared their simple supper, she looked up from her arithmetic with the serious expression that always preceded her most important observations. "Ali, Dad," she corrected herself, still testing the new word. "Do you think Mama knows I'm happy now?" Eli paused in his stirring, considering the question with the care it deserved. "I think she does. I think she can see that you're safe and loved and growing into the remarkable person she always hoped you'd become." Clara nodded, satisfied with this answer. "And Ruth? Do you think she's glad we found each other?" "I think Ruth would love you very much," Eli said, his voice steady, despite the emotion that always accompanied thoughts of his lost daughter. "I think she'd be happy that you're here, making this house feel like home again." As the sun set over the Pennsylvania countryside, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, father and daughter sat together in the kitchen where love had first taken root between a grieving man and a lost child. The journey from that first question about hunger to this moment of complete belonging had been neither straight nor simple, but it had led them exactly where they needed to be, home, together, fed by the only nourishment that truly mattered. The daily miracle of choosing to love and be loved in return. The new family portrait on the mantelpiece showed them as they were now, Eli's beard neatly trimmed, Clara's hair in neat braids, both of them smiling with the confidence of people who knew they belonged exactly where they were. It was official now, legal and binding, but it had been true long before any judge confirmed it. Some hungers, they had learned, could only be satisfied by love. And love, once found, was worth everything it took to keep it safe.